The taper. You've heard everyone talking about it. Maybe your coach has told you you're going to do one before your next big race. Maybe you even did one before your last big race, but you're not sure exactly what you did or whether you did it right.
Yeah, well, essentially a taper is resting up so that you feel fresh and ready to go for your big day, your big race. Obviously though, there is a lot more to it than simply that. So today we're going to delve into the what's, the whys, and probably most importantly, the whens of a taper.
It seems hard to believe now, but in the early days of human performance, tapering just wasn't a thing. In 1950s European Games, Czech Olympic champ Emil Zatopek took ill a few weeks before the Games and spent the better part of 2 weeks in a hospital bed leading up to the Games. He was only released from hospital bed 2 days before his 10,000 meter final and was pretty much written off as a contender. Surprisingly, to himself and everyone else, he won that 10,000 meters, and a couple days later, he also won the 5,000 meters. His success was attributed to that forced rest that he had in the hospital bed, and essentially, tapering was born. It would take a few years for the scientists to catch up on the hows and whys of Emil Zatopek's success that year, but the athletes weren't waiting around for that, and pretty soon, tapering was mainstream.
Well, fortunately, scientific research has caught up and answered many of the perplexing why questions around a taper. I'm not going to go into each and every one study in detail right now, but a review of 50 studies has indicated that optimal levels of muscle glycogen, enzymes, antioxidants, and hormones are achieved from a taper, whereas ordinarily from endurance training, we often see many of these depleted. The obvious end result, as desired, is a better race day performance.
These days, pretty much everyone tapers. One of the few exceptions is extreme endurance events lasting multiple days, where you're actually probably better off not going in fresh and firing because you'll start too fast. But we're not talking about that today, we're talking about triathlons, and everyone tapers for triathlons. I've actually done quite a few triathlons in my career where I didn't taper or went into it as a training race, and often performed better than anticipated. Of course, there's no telling how well it would have gone had I tapered for those ones, and I always tapered for my most important triathlons. So tapering is still very much mainstream.
Yeah, it brings up an important point because essentially tapering is stopping training, or at least that kind of beneficial training. So although they will hopefully lead to a better performance on race day, it can mean a subsequent dip in your fitness. So do use taper sparingly, maybe 2 or 3 times a year for your major A races. If you're doing a 10-day taper every month, well, you could end up feeling rather unfit by the end of the year.
So how long should a taper be? Well, that very much depends. It depends on 2 main factors. Firstly, how much mileage you've done, how much fatigue is built up in your body. If you've done a lot of mileage and you've been training for a long time for this one race, it's going to take longer for your bodies to replenish those muscle glycogen, hormone levels, and get them back to optimal levels. If you've only been training shorter sessions, shorter mileage for a shorter race, you can bounce those back pretty quickly.
Yeah, now for an Ironman, probably suggest something around 14 days taper leading into the race, 70.3, 10 days, and for shorter races, maybe 5 to 6. If, of course, you find you're still tired leading into a race, then extend your taper next time. If you feel maybe 2-3 days out, you're ready to go and then not so good for the race, then perhaps you want to shorten your taper next time. Obviously, this is all trial and error. Everyone is different. There's no one size fits all. So again, go out there, try it, figure out what works for you, and then modify it the next time round.
Tapering, however, is not foolproof. If you taper for too long, you're going to lose some fitness, some aerobic conditioning, and that sharpness that you get as you get fit. Similarly, if you go too short, you're going to arrive at race day tired and you can get really tight and really stiff, which is why the route of Emil Zatopek and just staying in bed is not actually prescribed. You need to keep supple and keep moving, but at the same time not deplete or drain any of those resources. It is often the hardest part of structuring a good training program.
Yeah, and one of the other big dangers of a taper is the extra available time that it gives you. I mean, as triathletes, we're used to cramming in multiple sessions per day, perhaps even in and around our busy working lives. And suddenly we have all this extra time, and that can leave you feeling quite anxious, and in some cases feeling like we need to fill that time. That is fine to a degree if that reduces the anxiety levels, but if you're doing things that are putting strain on the body, well, that's not so good. Another thing that comes with this anxiety is a sudden awareness of any slight niggles or aches. I mean, I'm definitely prone to this.
So am I.
Yeah, suddenly start thinking that this tightness in my muscle is an injury, and that becomes a big thing in my head. Now, if you end up spending that week leading into a race rushing around seeing physios, massage therapists, and having kinesio tape stuck all over you, well, that is doing everything, well, the opposite of what the taper is trying to achieve. And even if you don't feel any niggles or injuries, just that sense of feeling lousy heading into the race can start to worry you and feel anxious. But trust us on this one, stick to that taper and chances are you'll feel great on race day.
Don't overeat going into a triathlon. You're not a bear going into hibernation who can store lots of energy. Similarly though, don't undereat trying to keep that race weight that you're at 2 weeks before your race. Well-fueled muscles can carry an extra pound or two around the race course. Underfueled muscles can't carry anything around the race course. You've probably also heard of athletes carbo loading, eating mountains of pasta leading up to the race to try and get ready for the race. This is also not necessary. If you just keep eating normally with a decreased training load, you will see more than enough energy reserves to replenish all that glycogen and go into the race ready to go.
Now, as we said already, all sports pretty much adopt some form of taper. Darts, snooker?
Probably not, but are they really sports?
Yeah, probably not. Triathlon though, obviously quite a complex one. We've got 3 sports that we're trying to taper for and peak for on one particular day. Now, in terms of each of the sports, the swimming is probably the one that we need to taper the least for because it is a non-impact sport. That said, it's also the one that we could potentially make the biggest percentage gain on from a taper. But at the same time, we don't want to lose our feel for the water.
Contradictory.
It certainly is. In short, you want to keep your swimming up and keep swimming into the race, but potentially just dropping down a little bit of the volume, or at least amount that's going to strain the body, but keeping some intensity there. I know that sounds really complicated, but using my own personal experience leading into races, I would drop the volume down, I'd keep some race efforts or race pace efforts in there, even up to my final session before the race, so that I'm feeling ready and raring to go, but not overly tired in my arms.
The bike is a little bit easier because it's only major muscle groups and it's essentially just power pushing circles. It is essentially, no matter how little you do on race week, just like riding a bike on race day.
Yeah, and the run sits somewhere in between the two. You want to strike that balance between form and feel together with that freshness and bounce in your muscles. And obviously the run is the one that comes with the most impact and destructiveness on the muscles. So essentially you want to do as little running as possible whilst getting the muscles ready and firing to go.
So to sum up, the swim, keep swimming, err on the side of too much. The bike, do as much or as little as you like in race week, but recovery being the main goal. And the run, do as little as possible, erring on the side of too little.
Yeah, and to continue on the running, obviously you've got to remember that you will be 2/3 into the race by the time you get to the run. So when you see those athletes doing lots of strides and efforts the day or two leading into the race, just remember that by the point that you get to the run, you'll have already warmed the muscles up. So actually there's little need to be standing on the start line, ready and raring to go for that run portion specifically.
Also, one last point, if you regularly get massages and you're used to it, then race week is a good time to get a massage, just not too close to the race. If, however, you're not used to getting massages, race week is not the time to start experimenting with these things.
Certainly isn't. Now, as a quick recap, we would suggest a starting point of 14-day taper into an Ironman, something like 10 days into a 70.3 and 5 to 6 days into a short triathlon, where you're going to be significantly dropping the overall volume of your training, but of course keeping some intensity there initially and then dropping that off in maybe the latter half or second half of your taper.
Exactly. Let's look at our top 10 takeaways from today's video. Don't taper too often. 2, maybe 3 times a year.
Don't over or undereat.
Keep loose and supple throughout race week.
Don't do anything new, like your first ever massage the day before the race.
Keep your mind busy so you don't get too anxious or jittery.
Err on the side of too much swimming.
Don't ride too much at all in race week, just flush those legs out.
And err on the side of too little running.
Importantly, ignore all the niggles.
Unless, of course, they're serious. And you don't need to feel good until race morning.
We hope you've enjoyed today's video and we hope it's taught you something that helps you with your next taper.
Yeah, best of luck for race day if you're gearing up for one. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.